I have been super lucky with reads this year. I've read so many great books. And because we are now over the halfway mark, I thought it'd be good to look at the top 10 reads of 2024 so far. Now, this first one might be a bit shocking. It might be a surprise to those that follow the channel. But Dungeon Crawler Carl, book 5 and 6. Who'da thunk it? It is no secret that I am absolutely loving the Dungeon Crawler Carl series. I think it was my favorite read of last year, was the Dungeon Crawler Carl book, and it's distinctly possible that it will be the same this year. Especially now that we have the cover for the 7th book. It looks so good. I need it yesterday. Please, Matt. Thank you. Starting off with The Butcher's Masquerade, which is book 5. Now, this book in particular was one of the first moments that really hit emotionally with me. I read this series for a lot of the laughs and just a good time following a talking cat and a man as they work through this video game-like dungeon with this sort of over-the-top, crude humor. Really funny, always a good time. However, as this series goes on, we are starting to see way more of the darker elements come to the surface. In particular, with this 5th book. This was the first book that I thought, oh, okay, we're straight into some dark territories here now, Matt. But it makes complete sense for the narrative. I remember watching an interview with Matt, and he said that he pictured this series as I think he said sort of like an 80s horror type style of narrative. And I remember listening to that thinking, how? I do not get that at all. However, as this goes on, you will start to see more and more of these darker tones and side plots melding in with the very humorous, over-the-top humor. And you can see in that sort of realm of horror with the sort of schlocky type humor mixed in with these serial killers and just brutal murders, I can see where the parallels are drawn from now. But there was a scene in Butcher's Masquerade, and it hit the feels way harder than any other moment in the previous books. And the titular Butcher's Masquerade might still be the best ending to a Dungeon Crawler Carl book so far. The ending of book 5 was intense. And that's saying something after The Gate of the Feral Gods book 4, because that ending was insane as well. The Eye of the Bedlam Bride. I love this one too. And I loved it for different reasons than I loved Butcher's Masquerade. Again, all the usual stuff. Love the characters, love the world. However, what I loved about book 6 was the inclusion of some of this overstory, this political overstory of the TV show itself. So, in case you haven't read it, Dungeon Crawler Carl is about an alien TV show that chucks in all of human population into this dungeon where they have to survive and make their way down these levels in this dungeon, where there's monsters and creatures and bosses, and they can level up and find items to help them survive. And because we are seeing it through the lens of this ridiculous alien TV show, that's where a lot of the humor comes from, this sort of over-the-top, sort of bombastic, ridiculous situations that occurs. However, it's also really dark because we are following the humans who are trying to survive this. And as the books go on, you do learn more about the people who are running the TV show and this wider galaxy as a whole. And the dungeon is run by an AI, and the AI has a personality and is very funny character in the series. And some of the revelations with this larger picture in this 6th book was so interesting. And I think it will play a large part in the books to come. As well as this, each floor that they are moving down this dungeon in kind of have their own quirks and own little narrative. And the floor we're in with book 6 has this almost Pokemon-like card mechanic that was really, really fun to follow. Not going to get into it because I don't want to spoil it, and it is fun to learn about as you are reading the story, but I loved it a lot. Next on up, we have The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. Now, this is a murder mystery fantasy, very Sherlock Holmes and Watson style paired duo as they try and solve this murder about a man who was killed by a tree growing through him. And we follow Din, an investigator's assistant, and he is an engraver, which means that he's able to remember and recall all the sights and smells and sounds that he consumes with perfect memory, as long as he associates these sights and sounds to a smell. So engravers usually carry about these jars, and they can smell the jar, remember everything, tie it to that smell. However, you're not born an engraver, I don't think. Every single different ability in this book is something that has to be surgically introduced, biologically introduced. So there's a lot of biological mutagenic type magic system built into this world, and there seems to be different classes of people who can go through these surgeries and gain different abilities. There are cracklers, I think they're called cracklers, and it's just really jacked and huge muscled people who have to have extra bones put in their body to support the muscle mass that they gain. But what I like about these systems is they're always a downside, a limitation. For engravers, it is hinted that remembering everything can have negative impacts on one's mental health. Remembering everything isn't always a good thing. Sometimes ignorance is bliss. And while this was only hinted at in this book, I am hoping we're going to see more of it in future books, kind of take more of a toll on our main character, Din. Likewise, with the people like cracklers, they live very short lives because of the stress of dealing with all this extra strength. So, really interesting magic system. The mystery plot was really fun. It was very fast-paced. I do feel like I fell through this story rather than read it. It just had fantastic momentum that threw you through the entire narrative without it seeming like it was rushed. It was just fast-paced, fun, interesting, and a great mystery plot to fly through. And the world is really, really cool. I know I already touched on the mutagenic magic system. However, there's also this huge wall that contains society that feels very Attack on Titan, because out with these walls there are these massive creatures called Leviathans, and they attack the walls every wet season. It's just cool. I love it. Next on up, probably joint first place with Dungeon Crawler Carl, we have Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. Now, this is the second book in the Farseer trilogy. I did do a spoiler-filled video discussing the book. However, spoiler-free thoughts for this book, for this video. What is there to say about Robin Hobb, the queen of traumatic events and being mean to her characters? She continues to be awful to Fitz. Full stop. That's the review. I know I always talk about how mean she is to Fitz, and that is a big part of this story, but I don't want it to get overshadowed just how good this story is and how good the character work within this story is. Yes, she's mean to Fitz, but it also shows his resilience. It also delves really deeply into mental health themes. It does a fantastic job of creating this very well-rounded character in Fitz. We do start with him as a child in the first book, so where it's very much a coming-of-age story, watching him grow up and become a man and deal with the responsibilities that's put on him, and juggling all these different elements to life with his job as... It's not really a spoiler if it's on the cover. His assassin job for the king, and also his love for a certain character, as well as his friends and what he does for Verity and some of these other side characters as well. I would almost argue that this is a slice of life medieval fantasy where we are following Fitz just growing up and going through his life within the Buck Keep. It definitely plays with being a very political story, but also we get a lot of side stories with some of the side characters, and they really flesh out the world and all these different unique people in this story. I think that's one thing that Robin Hobb does really, really well, is make people feel like people. They aren't just dressing for the keep. You learn a lot about people like Lady Patience, Burek, Queen Ketrican, I think that's how you pronounce her name, Verity. There's so many side characters that just have their own lives that get touched on throughout the story that really fleshes out this to feel like an immersive, full narrative. And Robin Hobb's prose is so immersive. I love the way that she writes. Not a lot more I can say without being spoiler-free, so go read it. They're great. Next on up, we have Murder at Spindle Manor. Now, this was an absolute blast. This was such a fun book. This is another murder mystery fantasy. However, this one feels very different than the Tainted Cup. This one feels a lot more chaotic. There's a lot more humor involved. Someone in the Discord compared this to Knives Out, which I completely agree with. A large, quirky cast of characters, all coming together and trapped in this manor, as there's a storm outside keeping them all there, and there is a murder. And not only that, but we follow Isabeau, the main character, who is a monster hunter. And she arrived at Spindle Manor hunting down this parasite monster who is currently inside one of the guests at Spindle Manor. So as she tries to figure out which one is the parasite, there's also this murder, and it just complicates things, and things just layer on top of each other, and it gets crazy. The twists and turns in this narrative are a ton of fun. I also loved the sprinkling of world building we got in this. It did feel very fleshed out, despite the fact that we didn't get a lot of information. There are these creatures called will-o-wisps. They roam the dark places around the forest and the manor. We don't really know what they do, but they're creepy and spooky, and I want to learn more about them. There are also ghosts in this world, as well as these nobles who are like angel-like beings that are absolutely huge, and they have a really interesting place in society. And the sort of hierarchy structure of society is really interesting. And I feel like we've only just got the start of that from the first book. Enough for you to understand everything that's going on in the first book without info dumping all this information on you. So it is short, it is fast-paced, and it is fun. In the humor, there's a lot of really funny moments in this. But it's also got some pretty spooky moments too. There is one that I'm not going to spoil, but if you've read it, that spooked me out. I was like, oh, okay. I was surprised at how creepy that moment was. Next up, we have Princess of Oldir, which is a prequel novella for a sci-fi series by Brian Wilson. Full disclaimer, I am friends with Brian, and he sent me the first book, which I'm really looking forward to jumping into. However, when I heard that there was a prequel novella in this space opera epic, I thought, I need to check this out. And Princess of Oldir takes place on a desert planet, and it follows a princess called Rana. And the planet of Oldir is currently under a lot of stress and tension. There are these bandits that are disrupting trade routes. There are these creatures that are eating people out in the desert and the wild. And a lot of that stress is being put onto the royal family, which Rana is the daughter of. So when the head of their neighboring planet comes over to kind of try and help dispute some of these issues and make some offerings, things get complicated. This is a short novella, so there isn't a whole lot I can talk about. However, I really loved the world building. I haven't read the main books, but just some of the concepts in the technology are really interesting. What I really liked was the idea of storytelling promises, which is when something is hinted at or set up for later payoff. And I feel like there was a lot of setups in this book for really interesting story threads that will go into the main series. Ancient technologies and different... How much can I talk about? Ancient technologies. I feel like this world is very in-depth and has a lot of history and lore behind it, and we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg, which is some of my favorite things in fantasy and sci-fi. Is just when you get involved into a new world and a new story, and you just feel like it has this depth and history to it. It just makes you want to continue reading and explore more of this world and story. Next on up, we have the Silverblood Promise by James Logan. Now this is just a fun fantasy book. It's also got a murder mystery element to it, but it strays more into epic fantasy than murder mystery like some of the other entries on this list. We follow Lucan, the main character whose father just got murdered, and with his dying breaths, he scribbled down 3 things. Lucan's name, the name of a city called Safrona, and another name that we don't really know what it is, if it's a city or a person. And Lucan goes on a mission to find out what this means, why his father scribbled this in blood, and also what happened to his father. So Lucan sets off to go to Safrona. I loved the character of Lucan. He's very witty, he's very funny, A lot of his inner dialogue and also the way he interacts with the other characters is very entertaining to follow. The plot is fun and very tightly paced, and I really like the side character of Flea and sort of the dynamic that grows between her and Lucan as the story progresses. Not to mention the world building. There's a lot of really interesting ideas and concepts built into this story. There are these strange ancient items called Pharaon relics, and the Pharaon were people who disappeared centuries ago in the history of this world. But there is a wasteland where lots of people go hunt and find these relics from this previous time, and they're not really understood, but they do lots of different things, and we do come across a couple of them within this story. Again, much like the last entry, it's just this idea of a larger world and history. Really, it gets me excited to learn more about it, and the Silverblood Promise does that really well. Next up, we have another novella. It's backwards. War Song by Michael Mitchell. Now, this one really surprised me. Not because I thought it was going to be bad, but I'm just surprised how much depth to the character, the world, and how much heart is in this grimdark story in such a short little novella. I was so impressed with how much punch this little novella packs. Like I said, this is a grimdark novella, so it's a very dark story following Admar and this occupation of this other race who are currently very tyrannical and beating down on the people of this country. And this does a really good job of just making it feel so bleak for the people who are under this occupation and just their struggles and everyday problems dealing with how harsh these new people are. I think this is written really well. Ironically, one of my problems with novellas with such a short book is often the pacing can be very off. Sometimes it can be a little lopsided or very slow, which is weird when it's so short, but I think War Song is really tightly paced. I think it's done very neatly and just flows through the story very well. I also really enjoyed Michael's prose. It's very clean, very well written, and I just had a blast with this. And you can download this completely for free by signing up for Michael Mitchell's newsletter, the ebook. So highly recommend checking this out, as well as Princess of Oldir, which is also free if you sign up for Brian's mailing list. So lots of good free books as well. Next on up, we have The Bloodstones by Tori Tekken. The book opens following these three young boys as they stumble down and watch this execution. Any book that starts with an execution, you know is going to be a good time. It's just a great way to open. Sets the tone right away. And it's a coming-of-age story following these young boys as they grow up. However, as kids, one of them is abducted and taken away to join this brotherhood, cult-like situation. I don't want to get too spoilery with, but this does happen really early in the story, called the Bruhai. As well as this, we also have point of view from one of the other brothers that grows up dealing with this loss and thinking that his brother is dead. We also get a point of view from a character called Sindri. Now, she lives far away from the other characters, giving a larger scope to the story, and she lives in part of these warrior clans, and this is such a cool element of the story. And learning more about her and these warrior clans was such a blast, and the different culture shifts between them and the boys in this other part of the world, and also the hints at the larger political implications to some of these different warring powers. You can definitely see how this is all going to come to head in the future books. And the ending sets up the rest of the series so well. And last but most certainly not least, we have The Kraken's Tooth by Anthony Ryan. Now, this is the second book in the Seven Swords series, which is a series of novellas that I believe Anthony self-publishes. I might be wrong with that. But the two novellas I've read so far are just everything I love about fantasy. It has really interesting magic artifacts. It has great character work. In particular, this second book, we delve a lot more into Pilgrim and his past. We're delving into these sort of ancient places that not many people travel to. A lot of fun set pieces and different locales that we visit in both the first and second novella, all packed into these relatively short novellas. And Anthony is another one that I love. His prose is just so evocative and effective. I wouldn't say it's particularly lyrical or poetic, but just the way it gets across the world and the different characters, and the action sequences are always good. It's just really tight, neat, and well written prose. So let me know in the comments below, what is the best fantasy or sci-fi book you've read this year so far? I've been really lucky that I've read some amazing books this year so far, and I do think going by my TBR and kind of what I have planned for the second half of the year will be equally as good, if not better. So many good books I'm excited to read. So thank you very much for watching. Outro. Water bottle.